but if you can hear me, welcome to the Case Memorial Library in Orange, Connecticut. And tonight we welcome Andrew W. Kahrl, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Virginia. His first book, The Land Was Ours, received the Liberty Legacy Foundation Award from the Organization of American Historians. We're here tonight to talk about his second book, Free the Beaches. Among the many enthusiastic reviews of this book, Connecticut Magazine said, "The successes and failures of the activists give us plenty of lessons today." Library Journal said the book is engrossing and an important addition to the literature on 20th century racism in the North. Because we have a large group tonight, I would like to request that everyone remain muted except for Andrew and me. Please submit your questions for Andrew by way of the chat function, and please be aware that this meeting is being recorded and the chat will be saved. So Andrew, thank you again for coming to join us tonight. In your own words, what is Free the Beaches about?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming out and joining us virtually tonight. This is really a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak with your patrons and be able to engage with a local audience about the what is very much a local story of Connecticut, but one that I hope has larger implications for understanding issues we face today, not just with regards to racial inequality, but also environmental sustainability and public access to public space, which remains under threat, not just on shorelines, but more broadly speaking, and not just in Connecticut, with all of these issues. But my book is, it's a story of a person, and it's a story of a moment in time in the 1970s when these two issues of racial injustice and environmental protection came to a head, and came to a head quite literally on shorelines when a growing movement emerged, not just in Connecticut, but nationwide, to protect and expand public access to shorelines. And this is coming at a time in the 1970s, really, where we'd seen for the past several decades a steady privatization and enclosure of coastlines, not just in the Northeast, but all across the US. And I should sort of begin by stating that, I'm sure probably many of your viewers know this, but beaches are public land. I mean, legally speaking, this was enshrined in the public trust doctrine, which has been affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court, that states that the foreshore is public land, that it's entrusted to the states for the public. And so, and this has been generally throughout much of American history, both commonly understood and recognized, but that began to change quite dramatically, really in the decades following World War II, and due in part to the growth of real estate development, vacationing, and corporate development on shorelines. But in Connecticut, it began even earlier. And so one of the things that sort of drew me to this story was looking at this long history of privatization of shorelines that really in Connecticut began as early as the late 19th century, but then really accelerated and took on a particular racial and class dimension in the 1960s and 70s when Connecticut's population became much more diverse, even as it also became very segregated. And so one of the things that I was particularly interested in, I kind of drew me to the story, was one, the central figure at the heart of this story, someone who probably many of you, who've lived in Connecticut for a long time will be familiar with the figure of Ned Coll. I should begin by stating I'm not from Connecticut. I'm actually from Ohio, and but I was as a historian was doing research and had been doing a lot of work looking at the history of beach access and racial segregation in leisure spaces. And in the course of doing research on this, I kept coming across stories about this activist in Connecticut in the 1970s who was really employing some very creative, very controversial tactics to draw attention to the problem of beach access, and in particular its impact on communities of color in the state. The fact that many of the communities along the state's shoreline that had the most restrictive beach access policies were also communities that were almost exclusively, if not overwhelmingly, white. That much of the state's population were concentrated in urban centers that did not have access to any commensurate amount of outdoor recreational space, nor had access to much of the state's shoreline, which had by this time in the late 1960s and 70s, much of which had been privatized or had restrictions that limited, if in fact, if not in name, to residents only. And by looking at a figure like Coll, who, as I tell in the story, kind of stumbled upon this issue of beach access. Ned Coll began as a young college graduate in Hartford, who was idealistic in the early 1960s and decided to start his own anti-poverty organization, ran out on a shoestring budget out of a storefront on the north end of Hartford, and began with a series of programs that were aimed at trying to facilitate interracial contact and collaboration between the white families who had moved to West Hartford and really kind of abandoned the city of Hartford in the post-war years, and the Black population on the North End who were seeing job losses and seeing diminished public services in a city that was really struggling. And he wanted to sort of do something about this by bringing people together. It was kind of almost a naive, very sort of liberal notion of how we can begin to break down social barriers. He tried to organize picnics, play dates, bringing children from the city out to the suburbs and bringing parents from the suburbs into the city. And then at one point in the late 60s, he stumbled upon this idea of trying to bring children from the North End down to the state's shoreline during the summer. And this was really, as I show in the book, this was responding to a very serious problem in Hartford and New Haven and cities across the country, which was the fact that underprivileged, predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods simply lack the types of outdoor recreational facilities and amenities that most middle class and white American families took for granted and enjoyed in abundance in booming suburbs. And cities were suffering from budget cuts that forced parks to close, and also as well, resulted in shockingly high numbers of drowning deaths of children during the summer for lack of safe places to play. This was the case in Hartford around the time when Ned Coll began to become an activist. There were real tragedies that were unfolding in Hartford and many other cities, preventable ones, and ones that he wanted to address by trying to provide opportunities for children to go to the shoreline in the summer, like many American families did each summer. But then when he got there, he realized that there was nowhere they could go, that every town they went to, they encountered a resident only or other kinds of restrictions that prevented their group from being able to access. And it was at that point he became an activist on this issue. And he really spent the better part of the decade staging protests and trying to draw attention to what he saw were exclusionary policies that were racially motivated. And he wanted to really call attention to what the practical effects of beachfront exclusion had on those who were not fortunate enough to live or own property along the state shoreline. And so that's kind of the story that I tell, is how this unfolded, how residents in shoreline communities responded to them, sometimes in unexpected ways. I think, and also as well, what are the larger implications of this history for us today? at a time where we are still very much dealing with the problem of racism and racial injustice in America, and also dealing with this real, not just the problem of environmental sustainability in the face of sea level rise and climate change, but also this real erosion of public space. And why does public space matter to a democratic society? I think this is one that I look forward to us talking about tonight, and sort of what lessons we can take from this story.
Sure. Sticking with Ned Coll for a moment, could you say a little bit more about what his tactics were?
Yeah. Yes. So Ned, he was a kind of he was very unique in the ways that he approached he was very keen on trying to draw publicity to his causes, and he had many causes. He was someone who, I mean, the work that his organization, Revitalization Corps, as I tell in the book, went far beyond just trying to provide children a day at the beach. I mean, he was involved in every sort of aspect of confronting poverty and inequality, both within Hartford. For a time, Revitalization Corps really actually became a nationwide anti-poverty organization. There was chapters that opened up in cities across the country. But Ned Coll was really noted for his ability to kind of, he had a very clever with words, was able to kind of draw media attention to his causes. It was something that really, created a lot of enemies because he was very confrontational to the extreme at times, and very uncompromising in what he believed in and cared about. And so, and he was someone who, but also someone who I think this is hopefully something that comes through in the book as well, is he was not operating on his own. In fact, behind Ned Coll and behind Revitalization Corps was an army of mothers, teenagers, volunteers, many of the people who I interviewed for the book, now adults, but who were children who grew up on the North End, who became involved in Revitalization Corps, the parents who chaperoned these bus trips down to the shoreline, as well as idealistic college students, many of them from Catholic and Jesuit colleges and universities. Ned Coll was, deeply Catholic, and there was a religious dimension to a lot of the work that they were doing. And so, he was someone, and so I guess, but he was someone who was not afraid, in fact, actually relished taking the battle over racial inequality to places that were not accustomed to being challenged on these issues. Places like Madison, places like Greenwich, places like Old Lyme. In fact, it was an Old Lyme where really, he first encountered what he saw as the sort of ugly underbelly of racism within otherwise, privileged upper, middle class communities. When they brought a bus load of children down to one of the private beaches along the state shoreline, and really encountered a lot of racial animus and ugliness that he was not prepared for, and opened his eyes to what he saw was a deeper problem in these other privileged communities that he wanted to confront. So he did so. I mean, and I should also say, one of the things about this story, it's also kind of a legal history, because it's a legal history of this question of who owns the beach, and where is that line drawn between private property and public land. How is that line drawn? What rights does the public have to public land? And also this practical question of how do you get to public land if it is blocked on all sides by private land, which is the case in many of these communities. So at one point, one of his most inventive tactics in terms of both calling attention to these issues was at one point in when he staged an amphibious invasion of a country club in Madison, in which they came ashore, and these were these rafts and rubber rafts that came ashore in front of this the Madison Beach Club, and they enjoyed a day on the beach, and throughout the entire time stayed in the wet sand portion. So the club members couldn't do a single thing about it because that was public land. So it was very much kind of calling attention both to the rights that the public already had, and also how these rights were, in a practical sense, being denied by beachfront homeowners and by coastal communities.
Mhm. Now, in your book, you also bring the story up to date, and you report on how close it's come to happening that all beaches are available to everybody. And I know that since publishing the book, you've also been keeping up with it. So how are we doing? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm sure probably there's some folks in the audience tonight who are familiar with what happened this past summer when, after COVID hit, and we saw a bevy of coastal towns using the pandemic. And I'll say that, and I think again, it's let me preface this by saying there are very, serious public health matters that all towns need to take seriously when it comes to how we govern public space. But it seemed in many, and I wasn't the only one to say this, but it seemed as if for many communities, the pandemic was a pretext for being able to reenact beach access restrictions that the state Supreme Court had struck down in 2001 in the decision of Layden versus Greenwich, which was a real, and I devote an entire chapter to talking about the Layden decision, which I'm sure everyone in Connecticut is familiar with. That was when the state Supreme Court struck down Greenwich's resident-only beach ordinance. So at that point, after 2001, technically speaking, shoreline communities could not have public beaches that were public for residents only. But then subsequent to that, as I also talk about in the book, many towns adopted other measures of which aim to discourage use from non-residents or make it very difficult for non-residents to access public beaches, whether it be through fees that were inordinate for non-residents or through eliminating parking spaces, other measures that were designed to dissuade non-residents. And as I describe in the book, I mean, there's a long history of this as well. It's not just an either or, like, resident only versus open for everyone. There's always been a lot of kind of these subtle measures that have been employed for decades now. But then what happened over the summer is that you saw many towns hastily enact bans on non-residents from public beaches or public parks under the pretext that this was a public health measure to ensure public safety. This is again it's this remains to be seen what we'll be facing this summer. And then along with that, and this is something as well that maybe some of your listeners might be familiar with, there's been these sporadic controversies that have erupted. One case in particular in Old Saybrook, in which a beachfront homeowner erected fences that extended out into public land and was subject to protests. And actually an organization which I follow and on Facebook, and I encourage anyone who's interested in this issue to do so as well, the Connecticut Coastal Public Access Defense. They've been very active both in protesting and also sort of building a community of activists who care about this issue and see it as having larger implications for public rights and also building a more equitable, inclusive society.
Yeah, we have a question and a comment. This is from Lorena Venegas. She says, our town beach in East Haven restricted public use of beach to residents only during COVID-19. Can this be challenged because the town receives federal funding? And also, she notes that parking is the exclusionary tool to using public beaches in other towns. For instance, it costs $50 to park in Fairfield.
Yeah, again, this is, as I talk about in the book, I mean, these types of measures have been utilized for decades now, with it's almost undeniable that the intent is to exclude people who are deemed undesirable. And I should also mention here, and again, just something I didn't talk about in the in my opening remarks, but I think it can't be stressed enough, is that the story of beach access restrictions, and really these types of restrictions on public access to public space, have always been meant to complement and reinforce exclusions in housing markets, in schools, and in other areas of public life. That private beaches or resident-only beaches were not the engine driving segregation in Connecticut, but they were certainly part of that train, and they were certainly one element of a larger set of practices that were aimed at bringing about a more unequal and divided society, state. And this is and so in many respects, you can see here that if you have a resident-only beach or have restrictions that say makes it very cost prohibitive to use a public beach if you're non-resident, and you also have, this town also happens to have zoning ordinances that make it next to impossible for affordable housing to be placed in the community, and other restrictions that essentially price out large segments of the public. Then the effect is going to be that the people who actually can be found on that beach on any given weekend in the summer are going to be overwhelmingly white and middle and upper middle class. And so it's kind of an indirect, it's segregation in effect, but often in ways that can be gives its beneficiaries plausible deniability. But and in response to the question that was posed, I think this issue, and there's this issue of how do you kind of challenge this legally. The issue of who pays for these beaches, how they're supported, is a really important one. This was how beach access restrictions were being challenged in the courts back in the 1960s and 70s, and being challenged successfully. In the fact that there is not an inch of shoreline in the United States today that we as taxpayers have not paid for in some form or fashion. I mean, every single piece of, every part of the U.S. shoreline has been in some way the beneficiary of federal programs, whether it be from the Army Corps of Engineers to FEMA, to all kinds of different forms of aid that have created the shorelines that we know today. In fact, it's calling something even a natural shoreline today is almost an oxymoron, because there isn't. I mean, every shoreline has been engineered to some degree, and they've been engineered through, to some extent through federal tax dollars. So this was one of the legal tactics that was being used in the 1970s when this open beaches legal movement was really gaining steam, which was to say to communities that were trying to limit public access to residents only on the idea that it was local taxpayer dollars were paying for the beach, and then they could then determine who got access to it, to turn around and say, well, in fact, if you're going to make a taxpayer argument, you're going to lose, because we have all contributed to the making of these shorelines. And so this has been and remains one that is kind of used to challenge in court on this kind of very question of public financing.
Yeah, so in terms of parking and ancillary expenses like that, I guess the principle is that town beaches should be available to non-residents on exactly the same terms as they are to local taxpayers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, and again, like the courts have upheld, and this state Supreme Court upheld the idea that you could say charge non-residents, and you could even charge them a higher fee as long as it's not exorbitant and clearly intended to exclude. There can be reasonable fees that are associated with use of public spaces, especially given that they do require public funding to maintain. But the question is sort of then, can you have a blanket ban, which the courts have shot down, and also as well, what are the what's a reasonable fee for non-residents versus residents?
Sure. To the extent that Connecticut beaches are more accessible now, would you say that happened as a result of what Ned Coll did?
Yeah, I mean, I think, he left a mixed legacy in the sense that, he certainly provoked long overdue conversations on issues that were deeply affecting the state's population, and especially communities of color, and drawing attention to really the sort of forms of segregation that were being practiced in the Northeast that oftentimes were subtle enough that they were able to kind of, its beneficiaries and practitioners were able to claim plausible deniability. I mean, he tried to sort of pull back the curtains on a set of practices that, as he argued, amounted to a form of segregation that was equivalent to what you found in the South at the time, again, where the civil rights movement was being waged. I would say that certainly in the course of, and this is something I really, as kind of being an outsider, if and trying to learn about the state's history and learn about the impact that this moment in this activism had, I tried to interview and speak with a wide sort of swath of residents and people who lived in the state at the time, people who were both involved in or opposed to what Ned Coll was doing, or who were just watching it from the sidelines. And I think by and large, there was a recognition that even those who disagreed with his tactics seemed to acknowledge that he was raising issues that needed to be raised.
Mhm.
He was bringing to the public's attention a set of problems that had been swept under the rug, and that alone was an important contribution to bringing us to that moment. And certainly, you can draw a straight line from Ned Coll's activism in the 70s to the lawsuit that Brendan Layden filed against Greenwich that ultimately overturned the resident-only ordinance. So I think in that respect, in a kind of direct sense, there is a clear path from what was happening in the 1970s to the legal change and regulatory changes that unfolded in subsequent decades. Now to this larger question, which again, Ned Coll was, he's known for being an activist on beaches, but that was by no means what he cared about the most. I mean, singularly. I mean, he cared about addressing poverty, inequality, injustice, and the kind of isolation and ghettoization of African Americans within the state. To what extent we've made progress on that is one where I think there's still, again, much work to be done. And you can see it really, again, in the neighborhoods where he worked, where Revitalization Corps was most active on the north end of Hartford. I mean, Hartford remains a profoundly segregated metropolitan area. As I sort of note at the end of the book, I mean, the city of Hartford proper is one of the poorest cities in the U.S. And yet the metro area, if you encompass greater Hartford, is one of the wealthiest metro areas, not only in the country, but in the world. So how do you square that? How do you square this kind of, this isolation and poverty and decay that you find within the urban core, communities that have been profoundly left behind, with this wealth and prosperity surrounding it? And I think, again, that is a deeply unsettling but critically urgent story that we need to understand and take action on. And I think that was ultimately what his life work was about. And I think it's ultimately up to us and subsequent generations to really take heed of those, those urgent concerns.
Yeah. Here is a question from Patrick Hennessy, who says, I vaguely recall the relatively recent battle for Greenwich Beach access. Aren't those beaches now relatively more accessible? And I wonder if people actually bother to jump through those hoops, get passed from police station, etc., to gain access. That would be interesting to know if we happen to know.
Yeah, so it's and this again it's a really, I think, a fascinating and very telling story of our times. If you look at a place like Greenwich today, where the public beach, by and large, in Greenwich, is used by what within Greenwich's community would be seen as its middle class. Now, again, in terms of kind of income and economic standing relative to the nation as a whole, most folks outside of southwestern Connecticut would see everyone in Greenwich as being wealthy and privileged, which is not true at all. But nevertheless, one of the things, and this is kind of one of the dynamics that was unfolding as debate was happening, and as this was a subject of public controversy, is that residents in Greenwich who found themselves on the defensive over their beach access restrictions were saying, hey, our public, we're not the rich folks here, we're kind of regular folks living in Greenwich, relatively speaking. The really wealthy folks in Greenwich, they don't come to the public beach. They belong to country clubs. They have their own private, they're in a whole rarefied, circle that is beyond even what we can enjoy. And so, why are you picking on us? And so there's a kind of these different layers of class privilege and that's only become more pronounced. I mean, again, the sort of economic inequality within southwestern Connecticut has only, again, accelerated. Even years my book came out, and the pandemic, again, not to get that's a bit of a tangent, but I mean it's well established at this point that the pandemic itself has also exacerbated inequality and has proven to be very good for people who are very wealthy and not so good for everyone else. But nevertheless, I think this is part of this kind of complicated interplay of race and class and privilege within the state. And something that really fascinated me, I thought was an important sort of story to delve into, is how these types of restrictions in the use of public beaches were being understood by those living within these communities. Now, one thing I'll say kind of in answer to the question as well on kind of who gets access to these beaches. I tell a story toward the end of the book that is looking at what happened after the court handed down its decision in Layton. And so the summer of 2002 was the first summer in which these beaches that had formerly been for residents only were now technically open to the public. And there was a reporter for the New York Times who at the beginning of the summer season went, drove up the Connecticut shoreline to kind of test out, just how accessible these were. So it's a white woman, and she wrote this story that I sort of described in which she talked about, she went to Greenwich, and the person behind the gate was just kind of like, yeah, come on in, don't worry, it's fine, it didn't even in some of the towns they didn't even bother to ask her to pay the fee. They just kind of waved her on in, and then the following summer, and this might be something that some of your folks remember, two African-American women who were residents in Greenwich. They were actually the wives of two players on the New York Mets, Bobby Bonilla and George Foster. They residents of Greenwich. They were with an exercise group on the beach, on the public beach in Greenwich, and were ordered to leave. They were for violating some kind of obscure no group exercise law, and it was later found through a FOIA request of city records that this was clearly racially motivated by the lifeguard or the person who ordered them off the beach. And it was like, so here we have, the laws have changed, but for a white woman who's coming to the beach, doesn't seem like anything's changed, and it's as accessible as you could imagine. But for a Black person who lives in Greenwich, you still can't enjoy the beach without being harassed or even ordered to leave for no other reason other than race, which I think, again, gives us a sort of stark reminder here that the law is one thing, but then how it's enforced is an entirely different matter.
Absolutely. Here's a question from, I don't know who it is because they're identified as iPad 5. But the question is, have you seen any models or metrics that can be used by states to measure and establish goals for equitable access for all citizens in a coastal state?
You know, what one thing I would say again is, there are certainly states that have been very effective in ensuring public access and very vigilant in it. I mean, California is the kind of gold standard in terms. Although even there, they've been battling it out with billionaires who've been trying to close off sections of the shoreline to the public in recent years. But I mean, California, and I also tell the story in my book. I mean, because in telling the story of Connecticut and situating it within this kind of larger campaign for open beaches, I draw comparisons to what was happening elsewhere. So in California, at the same time Ned Coll is staging these beach protests, they pass by vote a referendum this sweeping beach access law, which creates the California Coastal Commission, which remains in effect today. It's a state agency whose charge is to ensure public access and prevent environmentally destructive forms of development, to protect coastal ecologies and environments. I mean, this again is, and you can see the effects of that. In fact, it's actually, sometimes when I remember when I first started working on this book, and I would be at, academic conferences or talking to other, colleagues who were from the West Coast, and they would just kind of look at me kind of confused, being like, what? Like the whole idea of like there being like these severe restrictions on beach access is like very foreign to people who grew up and came of age in California. Oregon as well is another state that has a beach access law on the books. But in terms of, and I think, in terms of kind of metrics, in terms of ways, I mean, a lot of this really comes down to all the things that are kind of that make for a more inclusive society outside of just explicitly dedicated focus on recreation and beach access, such as public transportation, such as inclusionary zoning, ways to make communities that are situated along shorelines more racially and economically diverse, ways to make these shorelines more accessible to people who live from outside areas. So expanding public transportation, making and expanding programs. And this, again, one of the sort of, this was one thing that did kind of emerge out of Ned's protests in the 70s was, at one point, Connecticut Governor Ella Grasso established a summer program to help sort of facilitate access to the state beaches. The one places on the state shoreline that were open to the general public. So there you have those types of measures, but I think in general, it's, how do you, make public spaces more accessible more broadly. One as well, and this again is perhaps goes without saying, is investing in these places. One of the sort of troubling developments we've seen in recent decades that kind of goes along with this privatization of public space is how many cities and localities are finding themselves, because of their own budgetary constraints, forced to sell off public assets, sell off public parks, or place management of them in the hands of private for-profit entities who have different interests in mind than, say, the public welfare. So I think you have to invest in these types of things as a public, and recognize that this is an important element of building a more democratic and inclusive and equitable society as a whole. And so I think that's what ultimately I sort of try to look to, is how much are we working toward these kind of big picture goals. And as we do, you'll begin to see alongside of it these types of elements of what makes for a good life, and what makes such as broadly shared access to recreational space. Those will follow.
Well, in the same vein, here is a question from Vicky. I think it's from Vicky Lucarelli. State parks on the Sound, on Long Island Sound, do we have enough?
Well, I mean, again, not being a resident of Connecticut, I can say that the question is really for you as residents and as voters to decide. But I can say that it was very well understood in the 1970s, the time period I was writing about, that there was not enough. And in fact, it was, and again, another part of the story I tell here is how the state's shoreline became gobbled up by private interests very early on. So I tell the story of the rise of private beach associations, which, kind of the first one was in Fenwick, in a sense, kind of was the precursor for the proliferation of essentially these gated communities. I mean, not all of them have gates on them, but they were all private homeowners associations that proliferated up and down the state shoreline, gobbling up much of the shore, leaving it such that there was, by the time you began to see calls for expanded public access or expanded public facilities, there was very little left. There was, that was one of the things looking through Ella Grasso's papers at the state archives. As she was sitting there sort of, throwing her hands up saying, we need to provide more space. I mean, because, during the summers in the 70s, and I don't know if this is the case now, but I mean, Hammonasset on a hot July summer day, they would be filled up by noon. I mean, you couldn't even get into the beach if you showed up there after noon. I mean, it was, packed to the gills. And so, there was, and again, there was nowhere else. If you were coming down to the central part of the state shoreline, you couldn't get into Hammonasset. There was nowhere else for you to go, essentially. So, this was and also there was very few areas that could be acquired, few if any. So the state was really kind of hamstrung. Now, one thing I'll say that, and this is something I've in the course of doing research on this subject, I've gotten to know and really learned a great deal from the folks in the state's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and they have done work to help kind of not just protect public access where it exists along the shoreline, but also to let the public know where their rights are and where public rights of way are. There's a great map that was put together by the department that shows every access point along the state shoreline, many of which, again, private homeowners might have over the years tried to obscure, if not block, but legally they remain rights of way that the public has a right to traverse. So I think, there is a lot of work to be done in terms of letting the public enjoy the rights that it already has, ensuring that those access points remain accessible, and also expanding and ensuring that they remain accessible, not just in the fact that you can walk along these pathways, but that there might be places you can park nearby, or some other means by which you can actually enjoy this common heritage that belongs to all of us. And so I think that's one area, but certainly, in terms of there is no kind of big chunk of shoreline left in the state of Connecticut that could be acquired for a state beach, and there hasn't been really for a better part of over a half century now.
So yeah, we'd better work well with what we have. I was really struck by something that was in the op-ed you wrote in the New York Times over the summer, how in around 1920 they created a state park in Westport, Shoreline State Park. Mm-hmm. And the town of Westport, what is it? They dug a ditch. They put a creek across the access road to the state park.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, and again, I mean, it was one of these stories that, my jaw hit the floor, but I probably shouldn't have because I'd become so familiar with, but this was a case where the state of Connecticut acquired this island for a state park, and the homeowners who lived adjacent to it did everything imaginable to try to keep the public from being able to get to it. And tried to gum it up in the courts, tried to sort of challenge it at every which way. And this was actually a story, again, when the pandemic was unfolding and the stories were coming out of towns closing off their beaches on the idea that it was a matter of public health and safety. Immediately I thought of that story because one of the things that stood out to me about that was the way in which these homeowners, these were these were like mansions nearby. I mean, very wealthy, powerful people who, I should also add, and again here, I want to stress this point, as was the case in Westport in the 1920s, as was the case in many of these towns in the 1970s, these exclusionary measures did not reflect the majority opinion of residents. They reflected the power of a wealthy, privileged, and politically connected minority who were able to exert their will and have their way. I mean, I think one of the kind of more heartwarming stories from the book that I tell is when, Ned Coll, during the summer of '77, he hiked the entire state shoreline to call attention to this issue. And he was, the expectation was he would be greeted with catcalls and rotten tomatoes or whatever people would be throwing at him. But instead, actually, a lot of people came out of their homes and said, hey, we support you. Like, we actually agree with you. So I want to say this to everyone that, this is a story here. There's a kind of maybe a silent majority of residents, even within these communities, that enjoy these privileges, who want to see them more broadly shared. And that was the case in Westport in the 1920s. But at the same time, this kind of well-connected, wealthy cabal was able to effectively exert their will over the town. They kind of were able to kind of get the town council to do their bidding, to wage this kind of protracted battle to prevent a state park from being created next to their property. And they did so not through saying, we don't want Black people from Harlem coming here, or we don't want poor Italians from Bridgeport coming here. They would say things like, we're concerned about public health. They would say, they said at one point that part of, some of these barriers that they were putting up were aimed at getting rid of mosquito populations and other things. I mean, they were saying it was anything but the people who were coming. And then even eventually they did say it was about the people, but they said it was, they said that they didn't want homeless people from New York, and this again is during the Great Depression. They didn't want homeless people, kind of camping out on the shoreline. I mean, but again, it's, this is I think there's a long tradition that we need to confront and recognize here of social exclusion and really the ways in which people of wealth, power, and privilege are able to use that wealth and power to wall themselves off from the rest of the public, and to appropriate public resources for themselves, and deny them to everyone else. And so, but recognizing as well that you can't paint a town with a broad brush. This was not a story of Westport rising up in unison against this. This was a story of a small segment, but one that was very powerful.
Mm-hmm. People who lived on the Gold Coast, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is an interesting question. Again, it's from an iPad. They say that they would appreciate your thoughts about how the National Flood Insurance Program drove up private development and coastal property values, resulting in more privatization, with taxpayers subsidizing flood insurance for these properties.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a huge issue. And thank you for asking that, because I think this is something that we really, need to address head on and begin to, especially as we are now seeing the effects of sea level rise and storms that are inundating, entire cities, like we saw in Houston a couple years ago. But yes, the National Flood Insurance Program, just to provide a quick history, was established in the late 1960s and aimed to provide federally subsidized flood insurance to homeowners in vulnerable areas, because private insurers just simply would not provide flood insurance. This was not something that the kind of private marketplace would answer to. And so this program, which was aimed at sort of providing protections for homeowners, has subsequent, but also as well, I should say that initially it was meant to be coupled with real restrictions on where homes could be built in the future, and ensuring that while people who needed it would be provided with flood insurance at an affordable rate. It would not, at least in its initial conception, would not be an incentive to build in dangerous and low-lying areas. But they got the first part right in terms of being able to actually extend flood insurance to people who needed it. But in terms of actually placing restrictions on development, they lost sight of that, and it's kind of really in some ways in subsequent decades gone out the window. And as a result, as the person who asked the question put it, I mean, it is actually fueled reckless development that has cost taxpayers untold billions of dollars and paying out for homes destroyed that under this program, but also as as well is one that needs to be addressed in a kind of more holistic fashion in terms of not how do we both protect and give people who are in vulnerable areas the ability to relocate, at the same time putting the clamps down on reckless forms of development that has been encouraged by the availability of flood insurance that the private marketplace wouldn't touch in a million years. And so the result has been, again, that up and down, coastal U.S. and in other parts that are particularly prone to flooding, real estate that maybe 3 or 4 generations ago nobody would have touched and left alone for good reason. Places like wetlands and floodplains and areas that were previously meant to be the sponges that absorb storms are now real estate, are now paved areas that instead become these. This is the story in Houston in 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, where essentially the Houston metro area, because there so many people were able to build homes in flood-prone, low-lying areas, that it only made the problem of flooding during that storm that exponentially worse. So this is definitely something that. But the problem has consistently been is where's the political will? There's been attempts to, in fact, actually there was a reform that was enacted by Congress several years ago. And as soon as it was enacted, the premiums on flood insurance went up so dramatically that Congress came back and basically repealed the law and just went back to the status quo before. And so there's been a real reluctance because, yeah, there's going to be people who are going to, have to relocate. There's going to be areas that are going to have be deemed, unfit for development, as they should be. But yes, this, the flood insurance program, it is not the sole cause of this overdevelopment of coastal areas, but it has certainly been a contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, there's a theme about the relationship between beaches that have, access restricted and environmental threats. The same towns, I don't want to, I should let you say it, but the same towns that restrict access are the ones that do the wrong things in the name of protecting their beaches, right?
Yeah, this is a kind of, this was where I was really trying to kind of put a finer point on why the public access is and ensuring open beaches is not just a matter of social justice and public rights, but is also a matter of environmental protection and sustainability. That consistently, and again, not just in Connecticut, but throughout the entire kind of modern history of shoreline development and privatization, you see coupled with efforts to restrict access, efforts to turn coastal areas from a commons to real estate, from public areas that are open to everyone and not developed, into areas that are privatized and developed, that invariably privatization and development leads to very serious environmental degradation over time, and also can lead to these types of perverse environmental politics that will lead communities to take measures to protect their beach for themselves while destroying everything around them, and sometimes even doing damage to the very thing that they're trying to protect for themselves. So, again, the kind of most basic example of this is, picture a beachfront homeowner who puts jetties and groins up on both sides of their property, extending out into the water. I mean, that just messes with, the shoreline equilibrium and ecosystem, does damage to shoreline processes, up and down the coast. I mean, and, these are well understood to be, bad for coastal environments, bad for the geology and for native species. And it also leads over time to erosion and sometimes severe erosion on everything on to the north and south of those jetties and groins. So it's a kind of an antisocial measure that is also very damaging environmentally. You also see, and this is one that I kind of point out when I connect the issue of beach access and kind of beach, the environmental conditions of the state shoreline with the efforts of many wealthy and upper middle class communities to prevent low-income housing in their communities. So one issue in many coastal communities, or one, I guess, sort of mechanism by which some towns were able to exempt themselves from having to provide low-income housing was the fact that they didn't have public wastewater treatment systems within their municipal boundaries. Even though in some of these towns, their population had grown far beyond the capacity to be, having homes running on septic tanks. And yet there was a resistance to adopting public wastewater treatment because not entirely, but in part out of a fear that it would lead to more affordable housing, lead to more development that would bring in again a development that in many respects could be much more environmentally sound, more densely packed. Residential developments can be very good environmentally, but there was a kind of concern that this could open the door toward state efforts to distribute public housing and low-income housing opportunities more broadly across the state. And so some local officials in these communities quite explicitly said that we cannot adopt these types of wastewater treatment and sewage because it might sort of lead to other outcomes. And as a result, you'll see, septic tanks will leak and, sewage will kind of, go off into into Long Island Sound and other sort of damaging effects, which in some ways can be tied back to this long struggle to keep these communities exclusive. So I think that's another way where you can kind of see how the broader effects play out.
Yeah. Well, that's bad news on top of bad news. So here's another good question, I think, from the iPad. When is use of eminent domain appropriate to open rights of way to long stretches of coast locked down by quasi-municipal corporations like fire districts that were granted extensive powers by state legislatures?
Yeah, I mean, use of eminent domain it's a tool that in the arsenal, as provided by the Constitution, but it's one that localities are very wary to use, or any public authorities. I mean, it's a blunt instrument that and can sometimes, certainly can be very politically volatile. Although again, I mean, we've seen, and sort of, I'm sure if anyone who's here who's from New London knows about the case that was decided by the Supreme Court that actually kind of expanded the use of eminent domain to include private purposes in the case of, and so that's, I think, again, there is certainly, that is a technically available, but it's one that I have not seen many examples and can't really bring to mind ones in which it was being employed directly to expand public access.
Now, you touched on this a little bit earlier, and you wrote about it extensively in your first book. What's the status of this issue in places other than Connecticut?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that drew me to the story of Connecticut in particular was it, and as I sort of in the title of my book, I think it is like the most exclusive or even the most exclusionary shoreline in the country in terms of the restrictions that are placed upon the public and historically have been. And so, yeah, Connecticut certainly, but it's not in any way a kind of, it's not a total outlier in the sense that the trends and the practices that you find on beaches in Connecticut are mirrored in many myriad other ways in wealthy, privileged communities across the country, whether it be with regards to public beaches and parks, whether it be in regards to all manner of public amenities. You will tend to find, and again, so sort of a troubling trend. These have actually accelerated in recent years. And again, we're still trying to see how the pandemic will, sort of affect all of these issues. But there are definitely, I would say, one thing was clear, and this, certainly in the course of researching for this book, is that the states in the Northeast tend to be some of the most restrictive in terms of beach access, and also we're really at the center of many of the legal and political battles over public access in the 1970s. Not just Connecticut, but New York State was there was some major cases involving public access to shoreline towns on Long Island. And again, that's in contrast to the West Coast, which tends to have a very different approach to public access. It's also in contrast, I would say, to say like, the politics of this is a little different, say in Florida, where in Florida, yes, there's definitely a lot of restrictions, a lot of again, wealthy mansions and other resorts and Mar-a-Lago, and I don't know, God knows how what restrictions are in front of that place, but also at the same time, I mean, Florida is a state that is heavily dependent upon tourism for its economy, and therefore also has a vested interest in ensuring that the public, especially non-residents from outside, can get to the beach. So because of the heavy dependence on tourism and leisure in that state, the kind of the politics of beach access are a little different there. But in Connecticut, again, much by and large, the interests of private homeowners, the interests of communities that are much more insular, certainly are not kind of vacation destinations or dependent upon a tourism economy for for their well-being. I mean, this kind of changes the dynamics in terms of what the local interests are. And also, again, couple that with the fact that this is one of the most densely populated parts of the U.S. So, and that's, I think, something that I really, another thing that really stood out to me about Connecticut was, and made it a very fascinating and I think important and revealing place to study these larger dynamics of inequality, segregation, and public rights in America today, is that Connecticut as a sort of contained sort of political unit is very densely populated, very diverse, both in terms of racially, ethnically, but also one that is very segregated and very unequal. In fact, by some measures, the most unequal state in America in terms of economic inequality. A state that has pockets of extreme wealth and privilege, as well as cities that have been suffering for decades with endemic poverty, job loss, and a real kind of economic contraction. So you put all these together, and it provides for a really critically important, in my mind, place to understand not just the issue of beach access, but how kind of the issue of beach access can kind of in some ways hold a mirror on a whole variety of different inequities and movements for equality that are unfolding and continue to be unfolding there and elsewhere.
Yeah. If we can keep going for another moment or so, here is a question from Aaron Good, who says, isn't beach access now primarily a transportation access issue? That is, towns exclude people simply by charging exorbitant parking fees for non-residents, which we touched on earlier, and also making it difficult or impossible to access beach areas by public transit. Think Robert Moses making the parkway bridges on Long Island too low for buses. Transportation restriction becomes the means of racial and class exclusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I mean, that is, I'm not sure if that's so much of a question or maybe an affirmation of a point that I made earlier, and certainly is one that I elaborate on throughout the book and provide numerous examples of how this plays out, both in Connecticut and elsewhere, and it's actually, this is something, again, I've written about, a couple summers ago. I mean, it seems like, again, the number of racist incidents and outrages, are just piling up. But if you recall from a couple summers ago when you had, and we still are having these space, these incidents of white people kind of calling the police on someone for violating some minor ordinance like barbecuing in a park or other types of these quality of life ordinances, and at the when that was really in the news and first got into the news, I thought back to how Jim Crow worked in the Northeast, and it operated through these types of measures, these kinds of ordinances or restrictions, which again, and I can't stress this enough, are selectively enforced. For some people, these rules don't apply. You can have a cookout in a park, nobody even bats an eye. I tell the story in the book of Constance Baker Motley, first African American woman to be a federal judge in America, who grew up in New Haven and had two white friends growing up as a teenager who invited her to come with them to a beach outside of New Haven, and they were like, yeah, we go there all the time, no big deal. And as soon as they came with an African American woman, suddenly members only, you can't access. And again, this was something that these other non-residents who just happen to be white were able to enjoy without any restrictions. So I think, again, this kind of all these types of sort of ordinances can be selectively deployed situationally, and I think that's something that the courts didn't really anticipate. That they struck down Greenwich's nakedly exclusionary law, saying that you can't just sort of tell non-residents that they can't come to a public beach, but they didn't really adequately anticipate or kind of adopt measures to address these other types of exclusionary devices, which in practice can be just as effective.
Yeah, kind of like if someone is trying to register to vote and you ask them to recite the Constitution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, the book is Free the Beaches, the story of Ned Coll and the battle for America's most exclusive shoreline. You should read a copy from the library. You should also buy a copy. And you've given us a great deal to think about, both in the book and in the course of our evening. So thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and to everyone out there, if you had a question for me that I didn't get a chance to answer, I'm always happy to engage with you over Twitter. You can find my email on my site. I'm happy to talk more about some of these issues, and again, and for those of you who are working on these issues, I know that this remains a hot button matter up in Connecticut. I am certainly with you in spirit, and I continue to sort of remain engaged with this, and so thanks again. It was a real pleasure to be able to join you this evening.
And thank you to all the members of our audience. The next talk in our series will be February 22nd. It'll be on a book entitled Pretty Evil New England, which is about female serial killers in the 19th century. So from the sublime to the horrific in a way. So I hope to see many of you again, and we will await the next book from Andrew Kahrl and hope to have him back. And I guess that's it. So thank you so much, everybody, and we will see you again soon.